I'm Margaret Sullivan, 29, and it's been 3 months since I watched my husband Thomas board the Hindenburg for what should have been a routine business trip to Germany. As I sat in our living room that May evening in 1937, listening to the radio broadcast of that burning airship crashing to the ground in New Jersey, my heart shattered knowing Thomas was aboard. But when a stranger appeared at my door yesterday with a letter written in Thomas's handwriting and dated 2 days after the crash, everything I thought I knew about that tragic night and about my husband would be turned upside down. What I discovered about Thomas's final moments would reveal a heroic truth that the world never knew, and a secret that would change how history remembers the Hindenburg disaster forever. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Like this if you've ever wondered about the untold stories behind history's greatest tragedies. 3 years ago, when Thomas first walked into the diner where I worked in downtown Philadelphia, I never imagined I'd be sitting here holding his wedding ring, wondering if I ever truly knew the man I married. He was different from the other men who came through those doors, quieter, more thoughtful, with calloused hands that spoke of real work but eyes that held secrets I couldn't quite read. Thomas was an engineer, or so he told me. He worked for a company that designed ventilation systems for large buildings, traveling occasionally to consult on projects. His work seemed mundane enough, though I noticed he never talked much about his colleagues or brought home stories from the office like other husbands did. When I asked, he'd simply smile and change the subject, pulling me close and asking about my day instead. We married in the spring of 1934, a small ceremony at St. Mary's with just our immediate families present. Thomas's parents had died years earlier, and he had no siblings, which always made me sad. He seemed so alone in the world until he found me, or perhaps I found him. I was never quite sure which. Our little house on Maple Street became our sanctuary. Thomas would spend evenings in his study, poring over blueprints and technical drawings. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of his work complex, diagrams with German text that seemed odd for Philadelphia building projects. When I asked about it, he'd explained that many engineering principles originated in Germany, and he was simply staying current with international standards. In the months leading up to his trip, though, something changed. Thomas became more secretive, more distant. He'd receive phone calls at odd hours, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up quickly when I entered the room. Letters arrived with foreign postmarks that he'd slip into his pocket before I could see them clearly. He started working later, claiming his company had landed a major international contract. The morning of April 30th, when Thomas left for his trip, I sensed something was different. He held me longer than usual, his embrace almost desperate. His goodbye kiss felt final in a way that made my stomach clench with unexpected fear. "It's just a business trip, darling," he whispered against my hair. "I'll be back before you know it." But his eyes told a different story. There was an intensity there, a weight that hadn't been present during his previous travels. He handed me a sealed envelope. "Don't open this unless ... He paused, running his thumb across my cheek. "Just keep it safe for me, Margaret. Promise me." I promised, though I didn't understand why a simple business trip would require such dramatics. The envelope sat on my dresser for 6 days, untouched, until the radio crackled with news that would change everything. Now, holding that same envelope, the one I'd torn open in desperate hope, after hearing about the crash, I realized Thomas's departure letter had been filled with coded messages I was too naive to understand. He'd written about completing the important work in ensuring the packages reach their destinations safely. At the time, I'd assumed he meant engineering components or building materials. How wrong I'd been about everything. May 6, 1937. I remember every detail of that evening as if it were burned into my memory with the same flames that consumed the Hindenburg. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner and humming along to the radio, when the regular programming was interrupted by a news bulletin from Lakehurst, New Jersey. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Herbert Morrison reporting." The voice crackled through our old Philco radio. "I'm watching the Hindenburg attempting to dock here at Lakehurst Naval Air Station." My hand stilled on the potatoes I was peeling. Thomas had mentioned he'd be arriving at Lakehurst. I turned up the volume, suddenly interested in what had seemed like routine news. Morrison's voice was calm, professional, describing the massive German airship as it approached the mooring mast. I found myself smiling, imagining Thomas inside, probably looking out the windows at the American landscape below. He'd have stories to tell when he got home. Then, everything changed. It burst into flames. Morrison's voice exploded through the speaker, his professional composure shattered. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. Get this, Charlie. Get this, Charlie. It's fire and it's crashing. It's crashing. Terrible. Oh my God. Get out of the way, please. The potato fell from my nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence of my kitchen. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles white as Morrison's voice broke with emotion. Oh, the humanity, those passengers. I can't talk. Ladies and gentlemen, honest, it's just laying there, a mass of smoking wreckage. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs no longer able to support me. The radio continued its horrific broadcast, but the words became a distant buzz as my mind struggled to process what I was hearing. Thomas was on that airship. My Tomas was in those flames. I scribbled frantic notes on whatever paper I could find, the back of an envelope, margins of a newspaper, anything to capture the details. Morrison was reporting. 36 people dead, he said, survivors being rushed to nearby hospitals. The mighty Hindenburg reduced to twisted metal and ash in less than a minute. For 3 days, I haunted the Western Union office, desperate for any news. The passenger manifests were slow to be released, and rumors ran wild about who had survived and who hadn't. I barely slept, barely ate, clinging to the hope that Thomas had somehow escaped the inferno. On May 9th, the official word came in a telegram that I still keep pressed between the pages of my Bible. Regret to inform you, Thomas Sullivan confirmed among fatalities. Body recovery ongoing. Arrangements for return, pending identification. Body recovery ongoing. The phrase haunted me. There might not be enough left of my husband to bury. The funeral was held on May 15th, with a closed, empty casket. Our small congregation gathered to mourn a man whose body lay somewhere in the wreckage of humanity's greatest aviation disaster. I sat in the front pew, dried and hollow, accepting condolences from neighbors who whispered about the tragedy and the cruel randomness of fate. But even then, something felt wrong. The officiating minister had never met Thomas, and his generic words about a good man taken too soon felt inadequate. Several people attended whom I didn't recognize, men in dark suits, who watched me more than they listened to the service. When I tried to approach them afterward, they melted away into the crowd. That night, alone in our house, I opened Thomas's departure letter for the first time. Through my tears, I read his words about completing important work and ensuring packages reached their destination safely. I assumed he was trying to comfort me with talk of duty and responsibility, giving meaning to a business trip that had cost him his life. I had no idea. I was reading the last will and testament of a hero. The weeks following, Thomas's funeral blurred together in a haze of grief and growing confusion. I'd always thought I understood what mourning looked like: the gradual acceptance, the slow return to normal life, the eventual healing, but nothing about my grief felt normal. And Thomas's absence left more questions than answers. The condolence letters arrived daily for almost a month. Most were from neighbors and acquaintances, offering the usual platitudes about God's plan and Thomas being in a better place. But others were different letters from people I'd never heard Thomas mention, written with an intimacy that suggested deep friendship or shared experience. Thomas was one of the bravest men I've ever known, wrote someone named Heinrich from Brooklyn. His courage saved my family. We will never forget. Another, from a woman named Ruth in Chicago. Your husband gave us hope when we had none. Our children are alive because of his sacrifice. Sacrifice. I'd read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what business consultation could possibly involve sacrifice. Thomas had been traveling to Germany for work, nothing more. These people seemed to know a different Thomas Sullivan than the quiet engineer I'd married. The phone calls started in June. They always came late at night, after 10 o'clock, when decent people were preparing for bed. I'd answer, expecting to hear a friend's voice offering comfort or perhaps a wrong number. Instead, I heard brief, measured, as if someone was gathering courage to speak. Then, inevitably, the line would go dead. At first, I dismissed them as coincidence or perhaps grief playing tricks with my mind, but they were too regular, too purposeful. Someone was checking on me, confirming I was home and alone. The thought made my skin crawl. Financial pressures added to my distress. Thomas's employer, Hartley Engineering, had been surprisingly unhelpful about his final pay and benefits. When I visited their office on Chestnut Street, the receptionist claimed they had no record of Thomas being assigned to any German project. His supervisor, Mr. Hartley himself, seemed nervous and evasive. "Your husband was a good worker, Mrs. Sullivan," he'd said, avoiding my eyes. "But I'm afraid his final assignment was unofficial. We can't provide compensation for unauthorized travel. Thomas had shown me his travel documents, his business correspondence about the German consultation. Either Hartley was lying, or Thomas had deceived me about the nature of his trip. Neither possibility made sense. I began going through Thomas's belongings with new purpose, looking for clues about his real activities. His study had always been off limits during our marriage, not forbidden, exactly, but I'd respected his need for a private workspace. Now, I examined every paper, every book, every seemingly innocent detail. His desk drawers contained the usual items: pencils, erasers, technical drawing tools, and invoices from various engineering firms, but tucked behind a stack of blueprints, I found something odd: a small address book filled with names and numbers I didn't recognize. Many of the names sounded German or Eastern European, with addresses in New York, Chicago, and other major cities. More disturbing were the notations beside each name: arrived safely 3/15, family intact for halves, children healthy for 20ths. It read like a record keeper's log, but for what purpose? The strangest visitors began appearing in July. They would knock on my door during the day, well-dressed men and women who claimed to be friends of Thomas. They spoke with slight accents: German, Polish, perhaps Austrian, and their English was careful and formal. "We are so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Sullivan," said one elderly man who introduced himself as Mr. Brennan. "Your husband was a good friend to our family. We wanted to pay our respects. When I invited him in for tea, hoping to learn more about how he knew Thomas, he declined politely, but left a small envelope containing $20 and a note for Thomas's widow, with gratitude from the Brennan family." Similar visits continued throughout the summer. Each visitor left money, never a large amount, but enough to help with my mortgage and living expenses. Each claimed friendship with Thomas. Each seemed to know things about my husband that I didn't. By August, I realized I was living with a stranger's ghost. The Thomas Sullivan these people remembered was not the quiet engineer who'd shared my bed and my breakfast table. He was someone who commanded respect, someone who'd earned profound gratitude from strangers, someone who'd lived a life I knew nothing about. I decided to find out who my husband really was, starting with the address book I'd found in his desk. If Thomas had friends I'd never met, if he'd helped families in ways I didn't understand, then perhaps they could tell me about the man I'd married. The first number I called was for the Brennan family in Philadelphia. When Mr. Brennan answered, his voice was warm but cautious. "Mrs. Sullivan, is everything all right? I'm trying to understand how you knew my husband," I said. "Thomas never mentioned you, and I'm confused about these condolence visits." There was a long pause. Then, "Perhaps it's time you learned the truth about Thomas, but not over the telephone. Can you meet me tomorrow?" As I hung up the phone, I realized my grief was transforming into something else entirely: determination. I was going to discover who Thomas Sullivan really was, even if the truth destroyed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. Yesterday morning changed everything I thought I knew about loss, about death, and about the man I married. I was in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast and steeling myself for another day of unanswered questions, when someone knocked on my front door. Not the polite tap of a neighbor or the authoritative rap of a salesman, but a hesitant, almost fearful sound. Through the lace curtains, I could see a slight man in a worn brown coat, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. When I opened the door, he removed his hat immediately, revealing kind but troubled eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan." His voice carried a faint accent I couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Margaret Sullivan." "Yes, that's me." He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see whether he'd been followed, then looked back at me with an expression of profound sorrow. "My name is Klaus Weber. I was with your husband on the Hindenburg." My knees nearly buckled. Klaus Weber wasn't on any survivor list I'd seen. More importantly, he was standing on my doorstep 3 months after the crash, alive and apparently uninjured. "May I come in?" he asked. "What I have to tell you cannot be discussed on the street." I led him to the living room, my hands trembling as I gestured toward Thomas's favorite chair. Klaus remained standing, his hat clutched in both hands like a shield. "I survived the crash, Mrs. Sullivan," he began without preamble. "Your husband saved my life. He saved many lives that night." "The passenger lists," I whispered. "Your name wasn't the passenger lists, were incomplete," Klaus interrupted gently. "Some of us were traveling under different arrangements. Your husband helped arrange those different arrangements." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, yellowed and slightly scorched around the edges. My name was written across the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting, but something about the paper made my heart race. "Thomas gave me this just before ... Klaus's voice broke. "He made me promise to deliver it to you if anything happened to him. But I was injured in the crash, hospitalized for weeks. I only recently recovered enough to travel." I took the envelope with shaking hands. The postmark was impossible, May 8, 1937, 2 days after the Hindenburg disaster. Either this was an elaborate hoax, or my understanding of that terrible night was completely wrong. "How?" I managed to ask. "Read the letter first, Mrs. Sullivan. Then I will explain what I can." With Klaus watching anxiously, I opened the envelope and unfolded 2 sheets of Thomas's engineering paper. His handwriting filled both pages, the words urgent and cramped as if he'd been writing in great haste. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then Klaus has kept his promise, and I have kept mine. The world believes I died in the crash of the Hindenburg, and perhaps that is for the best. But you deserve to know the truth about that night, about why I was really aboard that airship, and about the choice I made in those final moments." My vision blurred with tears, but I forced myself to continue reading. "I was not traveling to Germany on business, my love. I was returning from Germany with 20 precious souls, men, women, and children, whose only crime was being born Jewish in a nation that no longer wanted them. They had nowhere else to go, no other hope of escape from what is coming. I could not let them die." The letter fell from my hands. Klaus immediately moved to retrieve it, pressing it back into my grasp. "Keep reading," he urged. "Thomas wanted you to understand everything." When the fire started, Thomas's letter continued. "My first thought was of you, sitting in our kitchen, probably listening to the radio. My second thought was of the families I was responsible for. They were terrified, trapped in a burning airship 30 feet above the ground, and they looked to me for salvation. I could not abandon them, Margaret. I could not choose my own life over theirs." I looked up at Klaus, who was wiping tears from his own eyes. "He got us out," Klaus said simply. "All 20 of us. Your husband knew that airship like he'd built it himself. He guided us through smoke and flames to safety, making sure each person reached the ground alive. He should have followed us, but he went back," Bafta whispered. "There were others still trapped. Crew members, other passengers. Thomas went back into the fire to help them too." Klaus's voice was barely audible. "The last time I saw him, he was carrying an injured man toward the rear exit. The structure collapsed before he could get out." I returned to the letter, my hands shaking so violently I could barely make out the words. "I do not know if I will survive this night, but I am not afraid. If these are my final words to you, then let them be these. I love you more than life itself, but love sometimes demands sacrifice. The people I helped tonight will live because of what happened here. They will have children, build lives, contribute to the world in ways we cannot imagine. My death, if death it is, purchased something precious." The letter concluded with instructions that made no sense at the time but would soon change everything. "Go to the old mill where we had our first picnic, behind the large stone where you sat to eat your sandwiches. You will find the truth about who I really was. Tell Klaus the word Phoenix, and he will help you understand. All my love, Thomas." I stared at Klaus through my tears. "Phoenix," I said. His face crumpled with relief. "Then, you believe me? You believe the letter is real? How can it be real?" "Thomas died in the crash. His name was on the casualty list." Klaus sat down heavily in Thomas's chair. "Mrs. Sullivan, your husband was part of something much larger than either of us. Operation Phoenix was a network of people dedicated to saving lives, to getting Jewish families out of Germany before." He paused, struggling with the words. "Before what is coming gets worse. I don't understand. Thomas wasn't just an engineer, Mrs. Sullivan. He was a hero. And that letter, he wrote it 2 days after the crash, while he was dying in a hospital in New Jersey. He survived long enough to make sure we were all safe, to arrange for our new identities, to get word to the families who were waiting for us. Then he made me promise to find you. The room spun around me. Thomas had survived the crash. He'd lived for 2 more days, long enough to write this letter, long enough to complete his mission. And I'd buried an empty casket while my husband was dying alone in a hospital, still working to save others. Where is he buried? I asked. Klaus shook his head sadly. He made us promise to let the world believe he died in the crash. It was safer that way, for the network, for the people he saved, for you. Thomas Sullivan officially died on May 6, 1937. The man who wrote that letter wanted it that way. I clutched the letter to my chest, finally understanding why Thomas had seemed so distant in those final weeks, why he'd held me so tightly on the morning he left. He'd known he might not come back. He'd known the risks and chosen to take them anyway. The old mill he mentioned, Klaus said gently. Do you know where that is? I nodded, remembering our first picnic together 3 years ago, when Thomas was just a quiet engineer and I was just a waitress, and the world was a simpler place. Then we should go there together, Mrs. Sullivan. It's time you learned who your husband really was. After Klaus left, promising to return the next morning to accompany me to the old mill, I found myself staring at our house with completely new eyes. Every familiar corner, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the mantel suddenly felt like evidence in a mystery I was only beginning to understand. If Thomas had been leading a double life, then surely there were clues I'd missed, signs I'd been too trusting or too naive to recognize. I started in his study, methodically examining every book, every paper, every seemingly innocent detail with the scrutiny of a detective. Thomas had always been organized to the point of obsession, everything in its proper place, every document filed precisely. But now, I wondered if that compulsive neatness had been designed to hide something rather than simply maintain order. The desk revealed nothing new. The same technical drawings, the same engineering reference books, the same stack of invoices I'd seen before. But as I ran my hands along the inside of each drawer, searching for hidden compartments or loose papers, my fingers found something odd. The bottom drawer seemed shallower than it should be, given the height of the desk. I pulled the drawer completely out and set it on the floor. Behind it, built into the back of the desk, was a narrow cavity, just large enough to hold a manila envelope. Inside that envelope were documents that shattered what remained of my understanding of Thomas Sullivan. The first item was a passport, but not the one I'd seen Thomas carry. This one bore his photograph but identified him as Heinrich Müller, born in Berlin, Germany. The entry stamps showed multiple trips between the United States and Germany over the past 2 years, trips I knew nothing about. Beneath the passport were letters written in German, which I couldn't read, but the letterhead was unmistakably official. Government seals, formal signatures, the kind of correspondence that suggested Heinrich Müller, my Thomas, had been involved in something far more significant than engineering. Consultation. Most disturbing were the photographs, dozens of them, showing Thomas with people I'd never seen before. In some, he stood beside families, clutching suitcases and looking fearful. In others, he was deep in conversation with well-dressed men in what appeared to be official settings. One photograph showed him standing beside a train, helping an elderly woman with her luggage, while a young boy clung to her skirt. But it was the attic that held the real secrets. I'd only been up there a handful of times during our marriage, usually to store seasonal decorations or retrieve Christmas ornaments. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes that Thomas claimed contained old engineering textbooks and college papers. I'd never had reason to doubt him. Now, I climbed the narrow stairs with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The first few boxes did indeed contain textbooks and academic papers from Thomas's engineering education, but hidden behind them, in a corner partially concealed by old furniture, were 3 large crates that definitely hadn't been there when we'd moved into the house. The first crate contained more photographs, hundreds of them, men, women, and children of all ages, most appearing to be European, based on their clothing and the backgrounds visible in the images. Many looked frightened or desperate. Some carried identification papers that I could see had been altered or forged. At the bottom of the crate was a leather-bound ledger filled with names, dates, and what appeared to be travel arrangements. The second crate held documents in multiple languages, official-looking papers with various seals and signatures. Even without being able to read German or Polish, I could recognize birth certificates, marriage licenses, and what appeared to be immigration papers. Some were clearly authentic. Others looked freshly printed, as if they'd been created recently. The third crate nearly made me drop my flashlight. It contained stacks of money, American dollars, German marks, and currencies I didn't recognize. There were also jewelry boxes filled with rings, necklaces, and other valuables that looked like family heirlooms. A notebook tracked each item with meticulous detail, received from the Rosenberg family, the 12th of March, 37, to be sold for passage funds. Wedding ring from Mrs. Cohen, exchanged for train tickets to Bremen. At the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, was another passport. This one bore the name Thomas Sullivan and looked exactly like the document I'd seen my husband carry, except for one crucial detail. The photograph showed a different man entirely, someone who resembled Thomas but was clearly not him. I sat back on my heels, trying to process what I'd discovered. My husband had been living under a false identity. The real Thomas Sullivan, whoever he was, had apparently provided his identity to the man I'd married. Heinrich Müller had become Thomas Sullivan, had married me as Thomas Sullivan, had built a life in America as Thomas Sullivan. But why? And who was the real Thomas Sullivan? I continued searching the attic until I found what appeared to be Heinrich Thomas's personal effects from his life in Germany. A wooden box contained letters from family members, written in German, expressing concern about his safety and begging him to stay in America. Photographs showed him as a young man, in what looked like a university setting. Then, later, in more formal situations that suggested government or military connections. One photograph stopped me cold. It showed Thomas Heinrich standing beside a man in a Nazi uniform. They appeared to be shaking hands, both smiling for the camera. The date on the back was 1935, 2 years into our marriage. Had I been living with a Nazi spy? Had Thomas's heroic actions on the Hindenburg been some kind of cover story? My mind raced with horrible possibilities, each more devastating than the last dot. But then, I found the journal. Hidden beneath the photographs and documents was a leather-bound diary, written in English in Thomas's familiar handwriting. The entries spanned 2 years and told a story that was both more complex and more heroic than anything I could have imagined. January 15, 1936, made contact with the Jewish refugee organization in Berlin. They need someone with American connections to help establish escape routes. My position gives me access to shipping schedules and passenger manifests. I can help. March 3, 1936, successfully arranged passage for the Kowalski family, 3 children, all under age 10. They're safe in New York now. Margaret would be proud if she knew, but I cannot risk her safety by telling her. June 18, 1936, the situation in Germany is worsening faster than anyone anticipated. More families are desperate to leave. I need to expand the operation, but every new person involved increases the risk. Entry after entry revealed Thomas's growing involvement in an underground network dedicated to saving Jewish families from Nazi persecution. He'd been using his engineering knowledge to identify safe passage routes, his American citizenship to secure travel documents, and his own money to fund escapes. The photograph with the Nazi officer was explained in an entry dated a week later. Had to meet with Oberfuhrer Schmidt to discuss industrial cooperation. Made me sick to shake his hand, but it provided cover for my real activities. He suspects nothing. As I read through 2 years of entries, I realized I'd been married to one of the bravest men alive. Thomas hadn't been deceiving me out of selfishness or criminal intent. He'd been protecting me while risking everything to save innocent lives. The final entry, dated just 3 days before his departure for Germany, brought tears to my eyes. This will be my last mission. Margaret deserves a husband who can be honest with her, and I can't continue this work without putting her in danger. After I bring back these 20 families, I'm done. Heinrich Müller will disappear forever, and Thomas Sullivan will finally be free to love his wife without secrets. But Thomas never got the chance to retire Heinrich Müller. Instead, Heinrich died a hero's death while Thomas Sullivan was buried in an empty grave. I climbed down from the attic with my arms full of evidence and my heart full of pride. My husband hadn't been a spy or a criminal. He'd been a hero whose only crime was loving me enough to keep me safe from the truth. Klaus arrived at my door promptly at 9 o'clock the next morning, carrying a small leather satchel and wearing the same nervous expression I'd seen the day before. Together, We drove to Miller's Creek in his modest Ford, following the winding road that Thomas and I had taken 3 years earlier for our first real date outside the city. The old mill had been abandoned for decades, its wooden wheel frozen and covered with moss, the building itself slowly surrendering to the encroaching forest. Thomas had chosen it for our picnic because of its romantic isolation, a place where we could talk without interruption, where the only sounds were running water and birdsong. He chose this place carefully, Klaus observed as we parked beside the creek, remote enough for privacy, but accessible by car. Thomas thought of everything. We walked along the familiar path toward the large stone where Thomas and I had spread our blanket that perfect spring afternoon. I could almost see us there, Thomas laughing at something I'd said, his eyes bright with the newfound joy of courtship, both of us blissfully unaware of the secrets he carried. Behind the large stone, I murmured, reciting Thomas's instructions. But which side? Klaus was already examining the area, his practiced eye noting details I might have missed. Here, he called, pointing to the side of the stone that faced away from the mill. The ground has been disturbed recently. Together, we cleared away the fallen leaves and loose soil. About 18 inches down, my fingers struck something hard and flat. Klaus helped me excavate a metal box, roughly the size of a cigar case, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. Inside the box was another journal, smaller than the one I'd found in the attic, but filled with the same meticulous handwriting. This one, however, was written entirely in code, a series of numbers and symbols that meant nothing to me but seemed to make perfect sense to Klaus. Thomas developed this cipher himself, Klaus explained, flipping through the pages with obvious familiarity. It's based on engineering principles, mathematical formulas that would be meaningless to anyone without technical training. Can you read it? Some of it. Thomas taught the code to his key contacts in case something happened to him. Klaus studied one page intently, his finger tracing the symbols. This entry is from last month, just before his final trip. He was worried about something. As Klaus worked to decode the entries, I explored the rest of the mill grounds. Near the old foundation, I found evidence that the site had been used more recently than its abandoned appearance suggested. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth, cigarette butts that weren't weathered, a small piece of paper caught on a thorn bush. The paper was a receipt from a Philadelphia telegraph office, dated just 2 weeks earlier. Someone had been here recently, someone who'd sent a telegram marked urgent to an address in New York. Klaus, I called, showing him the receipt. Someone else knows about this place. His face went pale. That's not possible. Only Thomas and I knew about this location. Then either Thomas told someone else, or we're not the only ones looking for his secrets. Klaus closed the journal abruptly. We need to leave now. What did you find in there? Thomas wasn't just running a rescue operation. Mrs. Sullivan, he was documenting something much more dangerous. Klaus grabbed my arm, leading me quickly back toward the car. He was collecting evidence of what the Nazis are planning. Names, dates, locations of concentration camps being built. Shipping manifests for trains carrying people who never reach their destinations. My blood turned cold. Evidence for what? For the world to know what's really happening in Germany. Thomas believed someone needed to preserve the truth, to make sure history would remember the victims, even if they didn't survive, to tell their own stories. We reached the car just as another vehicle turned onto the narrow road leading to the mill. Klaus pushed me into the passenger seat and started the engine without waiting to see who was approaching. Who would be looking for Thomas's evidence? I asked as we drove away. People who don't want that evidence to survive, Klaus replied grimly. Thomas made enemies on both sides of the Atlantic. The Nazis knew someone was helping families escape, even if they didn't know it was him. And there are people in America who think we should mind our own business about what happens in Europe. As we drove back toward Philadelphia, Klaus continued, decoding entries from the journal. The picture that emerged was both heroic and terrifying. Thomas had been part of an international network of people working to expose Nazi atrocities, while simultaneously rescuing their victims. The refugee operation was only part of his mission. He'd also been collecting documentary evidence of systematic persecution that was escalating into something even worse. Operation Phoenix, Klaus explained, wasn't just about saving individual families, it was about preserving the truth for history. Thomas believed that someday, people would deny what happened in Germany. He wanted to make sure there was proof. One decoded entry made my heart skip. Margaret must never know the full extent of this work. If my evidence is discovered, She could become a target. I've hidden the most dangerous documents separately. Only the final key will reveal their location. What final key? I asked. Klaus shook his head. I don't know. Thomas was careful about compartmentalizing information. Even his closest associates only knew pieces of the full operation. When we arrived back at my house, Klaus walked me to the door but declined to come inside. I need to contact the others, he said. If someone else knows about the mill, then the entire network could be compromised. What others? The families Thomas saved. They're scattered across the country now, but we stay in touch. We watch out for each other. Klaus handed me the journal. Guard this carefully, Mrs. Sullivan, and if anyone comes asking about Thomas or his work, tell them nothing. Not until we know who can be trusted. That night, I sat at Thomas's desk with the coded journal open before me, trying to make sense of the symbols and numbers. Without Klaus's help, most of it remained indecipherable, but gradually I began to recognize patterns. Numbers that corresponded to dates, symbols that seemed to represent places or people. One symbol appeared repeatedly throughout the Junola small drawing that looked like a phoenix rising from flames. It appeared beside certain names, certain dates, certain locations. Thomas's personal signature for something significant, that as I studied the journal more closely, I realized that many of the phoenix symbols appeared beside entries that weren't coded at all. They were addresses, American addresses, scattered across the country. 20 addresses, to be exact. 20 families. The same number Klaus had mentioned from the Hindenburg. I was looking at a contact list for the people Thomas had died to save, and if someone was looking for Thomas's evidence, these families could be in danger. I reached for the telephone, then hesitated. Klaus had warned me to trust no one, but I couldn't sit idle while 20 families faced potential threats. Thomas had died protecting these people. The least I could do was warn them, but first, I needed to find the final key Thomas had mentioned. Somewhere in our house, hidden better than anything I'd discovered so far, was the evidence my husband had considered too dangerous to keep with his other documents. Evidence that someone was willing to kill for 3 days. I lived like a detective in my own home, searching for Thomas's final key, while simultaneously working to decode the journal he'd left at the mill. Klaus had taught me the basic principles of the cipher, mathematical formulas based on engineering constants that only someone with technical training would recognize, but progress was frustratingly slow. The breakthrough came when I realized Thomas had been using our anniversary date as a numerical modifier for his code. April 15, 1934 to April 15, 34 appeared as a recurring sequence that shifted the meaning of other symbols. Once I understood that personal touch, the journal began revealing its secrets. The story that emerged was far more complex than Klaus had initially revealed. Operation Phoenix wasn't just a rescue network for Jewish families. It was a comprehensive intelligence operation designed to document Nazi activities for eventual prosecution. Thomas and his associates had been collecting evidence of systematic persecution, property confiscation, and worse, references to resettlement programs and final solutions that made my blood run cold. One entry, decoded with trembling hands, described Thomas's growing horror at what he was witnessing. Visited Dachau under cover of industrial inspection. What I saw there defies description. This is not persecution, it is systematic extermination. The world must know, but who will believe such madness? Another entry revealed the scope of the evidence Thomas had gathered, compiled 47 witness testimonies, 23 photographs of camp conditions, shipping manifests for 12 resettlement trains, financial records showing confiscated property values exceeding 200 million marks. If exposed, this evidence could change international opinion overnight. But where was that evidence now? Every decoded entry referenced the final repository and the key that opens all doors. But Thomas had been maddeningly vague about the location. I'd searched every inch of our house twice, examined every book for hidden compartments, and checked behind every piece of furniture for concealed spaces. It was Klaus who provided the insight that changed everything. He arrived on the 4th day with news that chilled me to the bone. 2 of the families on your list have disappeared, he reported, his face grave. The Webbers in Chicago and the Cohens in Boston. Their neighbors say men in dark suits came asking questions about their immigration status. The families packed hastily and left without forwarding addresses. They're being hunted, I said, the reality finally sinking in. Which means someone knows about Thomas's work and is trying to silence the evidence. We need to find that final repository before they do. I showed Klaus the decoded entries about the evidence Thomas had collected. His face grew increasingly troubled as he read. "This is dynamite," he whispered. "If Thomas really documented all of this, it could expose the entire Nazi program years before the world is ready to believe it. But only if we can find where he hid it." Klaus studied the journal more carefully, paying particular attention to the phoenix symbols I'd identified. "These addresses," he said, pointing to the list of family locations, "they're not just contact information. Look at the pattern." He was right. The 20 addresses weren't randomly distributed across the country. When plotted on a map, they formed a rough circle around a central point: Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Amish country, where outsiders rarely ventured and local communities protected their privacy fiercely. "Thomas chose his hiding place carefully," Klaus observed. "Somewhere the authorities wouldn't think to look. In a community that values silence and doesn't trust government interference." But Lancaster County covered hundreds of square miles. Without more specific guidance, we could search for months without finding Thomas's repository. The answer came from an unexpected source: the passenger manifest Klaus had saved from the Hindenburg. I'd been studying it alongside the journal, trying to understand how Thomas had selected which families to rescue, when I noticed something odd about the way he'd annotated the list. Next to each name was a number, not a seat assignment or ticket number, but what appeared to be coordinates. When I cross-referenced these numbers with a detailed map of Lancaster County, they pointed to a specific location: an old Amish farmhouse outside the town of Intercourse. "That's where Jacob Stoltzfus lives," Klaus said when I showed him the coordinates. "He's one of us parts of the network. Thomas must have arranged to hide the evidence with him." We drove to Lancaster County the next morning, following winding roads through rolling farmland where horse-drawn buggies shared the path with automobiles. The Stoltzfus farm was exactly what I'd expected: a pristine white farmhouse surrounded by well-tended fields, with barns and outbuildings that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. Jacob Stoltzfus was a man of few words, but his eyes revealed deep intelligence and profound sadness when Klaus explained why we'd come. He led us to his barn without speaking, then removed several loose boards from what appeared to be a solid wall. Behind the boards was a hidden room, carefully ventilated and lined with metal to protect against moisture. Inside were 20 wooden crates, each labeled with a phoenix symbol and a number corresponding to one of the families Thomas had saved. Each family carried one piece of the puzzle, Jacob explained in heavily accented English. Thomas said if something happened to him, all 20 pieces would need to be brought together to reveal the full truth. Klaus and I spent hours examining the contents of each crate. Together, they contained the most comprehensive documentation of Nazi persecution I could have imagined: photographs that turned my stomach, witness testimonies that brought tears to my eyes, financial records that revealed the systematic looting of an entire people, and shipping manifests that tracked human cargo like livestock. But the most damning evidence was in the 20th crate, the one that corresponded to Thomas's own position in the network. It contained correspondence between Nazi officials and American businessmen, documenting financial arrangements that made American companies complicit in the persecution. Names I recognized from newspaper headlines. Corporations that advertised their patriotism while secretly profiting from misery. This is why someone's hunting the families, I realized. It's not just about exposing Nazi crimes, it's about protecting American collaborators. Klaus nodded grimly. Thomas was documenting treason, as well as genocide. This evidence could destroy careers, topple governments, change the course of history itself. As we carefully repacked the crates, Jacob offered a sobering observation. "Your husband knew this evidence was too dangerous for any one person to protect. That's why he scattered it among the families. Even if some were captured, the full truth would survive." But now those families were being systematically hunted, their pieces of the evidence at risk of being lost forever. Thomas had created the perfect system for preserving historical truth, but he'd underestimated how far his enemies would go to destroy it. "What do we do now?" I asked Klaus, as we prepared to leave the farm. "We do what Thomas would have done," he replied. "We protect the evidence and the families, no matter what it costs." I looked back at the hidden room where my husband's life's work was stored, documentation of humanity's capacity for both evil and heroism, preserved by a man who'd given everything to ensure the truth survived. Thomas hadn't just died a hero's death on the Hindenburg, He'd lived a hero's life, and his legacy was more important than either of us had imagined. The photograph collection Klaus and I discovered at the Stotzfus farm contained more than just evidence of Nazi revealed the faces of hope itself. 20 families, captured in moments of relief and gratitude, their eyes showing the transformation from terror to safety that Thomas had made possible. Each photograph told a story. The Rosenberg family, with 3 young children clutching toy bears as they smiled tentatively at the camera. The elderly Brennans, who I now realized had been the kind men who'd visited me with condolences and money. Sarah and David Cohen, a young couple whose wedding rings gleamed in the photograph taken just days after their arrival in America. But it was Klaus who helped me understand the true scope of what Thomas had accomplished. Over the following days, he began introducing me to other members of the network, people I never would have suspected were involved in such dangerous work. Dr. Robert Hayes, the quiet physician who lived 3 blocks from our house, had been forging medical certificates to help refugees claim disability exemptions from deportation. Senora Elena Bas, who ran the small grocery store where I bought our weekly supplies, had been using her business as a mail drop for coded communications between network members. Even more surprising was Father Michael O'Brien from St. Mary's, the same priest who had conducted Thomas's funeral service. He'd been hiding refugees in the church basement, providing sanctuary while Thomas arranged permanent relocation. Your husband was our coordinator, Father O'Brien explained when Klaus brought me to meet him privately. He had the technical knowledge to plan routes, the language skills to communicate with contacts in Germany, and the courage to make the dangerous trips himself. But why didn't he tell me? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since Klaus first appeared at my door. Dr. Hayes, who had been quietly listening to our conversation, answered with the perspective of someone who'd lost patience to Nazi persecution. Because he loved you too much to put you at risk. The SS has agents in America, Mrs. Sullivan. They're hunting network members and their families. Thomas kept you safe by keeping you ignorant. The network, I learned, was far more extensive than I'd imagined. It stretched from Philadelphia to New York, from Chicago to San Francisco, encompassing dozens of people from all walks of life. Businessmen provided funding, teachers created false documentation, dock workers arranged secret passage, and ordinary citizens opened their homes to strangers in desperate need. Mrs. Elena Vasquez invited me to her store one evening, after closing time, where she showed me the hidden room behind her stockroom, where she'd stored coded messages and emergency supplies. The walls were covered with photographs of families she'd helped, men, women, and children who'd passed through Philadelphia on their way to new lives. Thomas brought them all to me first, she explained, tears in her eyes. They were so frightened, so grateful. Many had lost everything: homes, businesses, family members who couldn't escape. But Thomas gave them hope. She showed me a letter from the Kowalski family, now living safely in Detroit. Their 3 young children were thriving in American schools, and Mr. Kowalski had found work as a watchmaker, rebuilding the life he'd lost in Warsaw. Their letter included a photograph of the children playing in a Farrakhan backyard, their faces bright with the joy that only safety can bring. This is why we did it, Mrs. Vasquez said. Not for politics or ideology, but for them, for the chance to save innocent lives. Dr. Hayes had been documenting the medical condition of refugees when they arrived, creating a record of the trauma. His files, which he shared with me in strict confidence, painted a horrifying picture of systematic brutality that contradicted everything the German government claimed about their treatment of Jewish citizens: malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma that spoke of sustained terror. He reported, "These weren't people fleeing economic hardship, Mrs. Sullivan. They were survivors of deliberate persecution, and the stories they told suggested something far worse was coming." Father O'Brien's involvement had been perhaps the most dangerous of all. As a Catholic priest, he had official connections that made his activities visible to authorities, but he'd used his position to create a sanctuary that even the most auspicious investigators wouldn't dare violate. The basement of St. Mary's housed 43 people over 18 months, he told me. Families waiting for Thomas to arrange permanent placement, individuals too injured or traumatized to travel immediately, children separated from their parents who needed time to heal. He showed me a hidden book where he'd recorded the names and stories of everyone he'd sheltered. Reading those entries was like witnessing the gradual destruction of an entire civilization: professors who'd lost their universities, shopkeepers whose businesses had been seized, children who'd watched their parents disappear in the middle of the night. But alongside the horror was evidence of incredible resilience, people who'd lost everything rebuilding their lives with determination and grace. Children adapting to new languages and customs while maintaining their cultural identity. Families discovering that survival was only the beginning of their journey to freedom. The network had been Thomas's greatest achievement, but it was also his most dangerous legacy. Klaus explained that several European contacts had been arrested in recent months, and there were signs that Nazi agents were actively hunting network members in America. That's why the families are disappearing, he said. Someone's working systematically through Thomas's contact list, trying to silence the people who could testify about his evidence. The implications were terrifying. If the network was compromised, not only would Thomas's evidence be lost, but dozens of innocent people, both refugees and their American protectors, would be at risk, Dr. Hayes suggested. We considered turning Thomas's evidence over to federal authorities, but Klaus shook his head firmly. Thomas didn't trust the government. He had good reasons. Some of the American collaborators he documented hold high positions in Washington. Mrs. Vasquez proposed moving all the refugee families to new locations with false identities, but the logistics were overwhelming. Many had established lives in their new communities and couldn't simply disappear without arousing suspicion. Father O'Brien offered the most sobering perspective. Thomas died believing that truth would eventually triumph over evil. But he also knew that truth-tellers often don't survive to see their vindication. We have to decide whether preserving his evidence is worth the risk to ourselves and the people we're trying to protect. As I sat in that church basement, surrounded by people who'd risked everything to save strangers, I realized that Thomas had been part of something much larger than a rescue operation. He'd been part of a moral revolution, ordinary people choosing to act with extraordinary courage when their government and their society were content to look away from atrocity. The photographs of the 20 families weren't just documentation of successful rescues, they were proof that goodness could triumph over evil, that individual actions could change the course of history, that love was stronger than hate. Thomas had saved 20 families, but his real legacy was the network of people who continued his work even after his death. People who chose conscience over safety, who risked their own lives to protect others, who refused to be passive observers when they could be active heroes. I was beginning to understand that honoring Thomas's memory meant more than preserving his evidence. It meant continuing his mission, protecting the people he'd saved, and ensuring that the network he'd built could survive to save others. But first, we had to keep the hunters from destroying everything Thomas had died to protect. Among Thomas's hidden documents, Klaus found something that made the heroism of that final night even more remarkable: detailed blueprints of the Hindenburg itself, annotated in Thomas's precise handwriting with escape routes, emergency procedures, and structural weak points. My husband hadn't boarded that airship as a passenger, he'd boarded as someone who understood exactly how it was built and how it could fail. Thomas spent months studying these plans, Klaus explained as we examined the blueprints spread across my kitchen table. He knew the German authorities were becoming suspicious of the refugee network. This was planned as our final mission: 20 families, all traveling under different pretenses, all depending on Thomas to get them safely to America. The annotations revealed the depth of Thomas's preparation. He'd identified the safest passenger compartments, the quickest routes to emergency exits, and even the optimal seating arrangements to ensure his charges could reach safety if disaster struck. What had appeared to be a routine passenger manifest was actually a carefully orchestrated evacuation plan. But why take such a risk? I asked. If the network was already compromised, why attempt such a large operation? Klaus's expression grew somber because time was running out. Thomas had received word that mass deportations were beginning. Camps were being constructed specifically for extermination, not just detention. These 20 families were on a list. They would have been among the first to disappear. He showed me a coded message Thomas had received just 2 weeks before his departure, decoded using the cipher I'd learned to read. The contents made my blood run cold. Final selections complete. Transport scheduled June 15th. This is their last chance. Thomas had chosen to risk everything because the alternative was certain death for 20 innocent people. The passenger testimonies Klaus had collected painted a vivid picture of that final flight. The families had been nervous but hopeful, knowing they were finally escaping the nightmare that Germany had become. They'd seen Thomas, as their guardian angel, come confident and completely in control, even as political tensions made every moment dangerous. He moved among us during the flight like a shepherd tending his flock, wrote Sarah Cohen in her testimony. He checked on the children, reassured the elderly, and somehow made us all believe we were going to be safe. When he smiled at my little Rachel and told her about the ice cream she would have in America, I knew we had chosen the right person to trust with our lives. The explosion had occurred at 7:25 p.m., just as the Hindenburg was attempting to dock at Lakehurst Naval Air Station. According to survivor accounts, the first sign of trouble was a burst of flame near the tail section, followed by a rapid spread of fire that consumed the hydrogen-filled envelope in less than a minute. Klaus had been near the passenger windows when the fire started. Thomas appeared beside me immediately, he recalled. Not panicked, not confused, purposeful. He'd been preparing for this possibility all along. What happened next revealed the true measure of Thomas's character. While other passengers screamed and struggled toward the exits in chaos, Thomas moved systematically through the passenger compartments, guiding people toward the escape routes he'd memorized from his blueprints. "Follow me exactly," he'd commanded, his engineer's knowledge overriding the panic around him. "Stay low, cover your face, and don't stop moving." The families later testified that Thomas had positioned himself at the most dangerous point between them and the advancing flames, using his body as a shield while he guided them to safety. He'd known which exits would be blocked by fire, which structural supports would fail first, and how much time they had before the passenger compartment became a death trap. Ruth Brennan, elderly and slow-moving, had been certain she would die in the flames, but Thomas lifted me like I weighed nothing, she wrote in her testimony. He carried me through smoke so thick I couldn't see my own hands, and somehow found the exit in complete darkness. When we reached the ground, he set me down gently and immediately went back for others. The ship blueprints showed why Thomas's actions had been so effective. The passenger compartments were located in the forward section of the gondola, beneath the massive hydrogen cells that made the airship so vulnerable to fire. Thomas had calculated that passengers would have approximately 90 seconds to evacuate before the aluminum framework collapsed and the compartments became inaccessible. He'd used every one of those seconds. David Rosenberg's testimony described Thomas's final heroic act. When the last of our families reached the ground, we turned to see Thomas helping crew members who were still trapped in the burning wreckage. The ship was collapsing around him, but he kept going back. My wife begged him to save himself, but he shook his head. "Not while others need help," he said. According to multiple witnesses, Thomas made 3 separate trips back into the burning airship, after ensuring all 20 refugee families had escaped. The first trip rescued 2 crew members who had been knocked unconscious by falling debris. The second trip brought out an injured passenger, not one of their group, who had been trapped near the rear compartments. The third trip was his last. The framework was coming down by then, Klaus wrote in his own testimony. Twisted metal and burning fabric everywhere. Thomas went back for Captain Lehman, who was still trying to coordinate the evacuation of his crew. We saw them both near the control car just before the final collapse. Captain Ernst Lehman survived that night, though he died from his injuries 2 days later. But his final words, recorded by the hospital staff, paid tribute to Thomas's sacrifice. "The American engineer saved 20 souls before he saved me. I have never seen such courage." Thomas's knowledge of the ship's construction had made him uniquely capable of navigating the disaster, but it was his character that made him choose to use that knowledge for others rather than himself. The blueprints showed multiple escape routes he could have taken to ensure his own survival. Instead, he'd chosen the path that saved the most lives, even knowing it would cost him his own. The survivor testimonies revealed another crucial detail. Thomas hadn't died in the initial crash. Several witnesses had seen him pulled from the wreckage, badly burned but still alive. He'd been conscious enough to give Klaus specific instructions about contacting the refugee families and ensuring their safe relocation. "Tell them the packages were delivered safely," Thomas had whispered as medical personnel worked to save his life. "Tell Margaret I kept my promise." Klaus had stayed at the hospital for 2 days, watching Thomas fight for his life while still coordinating the network's response to the crisis. Even dying, Thomas had been more concerned about others than himself, dictating letters to be sent to families who would be worried about the fate of their loved ones. "He made me write to each family personally," Klaus remembered. 20 letters, each one explaining that their relatives had survived and were being relocated safely. He wanted to make sure no one would spend even one night wondering if their sacrifice had been worthwhile. The final blueprint annotation, written in Thomas's shaking handwriting during those last hospital days, brought tears to my eyes. Mission successful. All souls accounted for. Network secure. No regrets. Thomas Sullivan had died as he'd lived, put others before himself, using his skills and knowledge in service of strangers, refusing to accept defeat even when faced with impossible odds. The Hindenburg disaster had revealed his heroism to the world, but it was simply the culmination of a lifetime spent choosing courage over comfort, conscience over convenience. As I folded the blueprints and testimonies, I realized that Thomas's death hadn't been a tragic end to his story, had been the perfect completion of his mission. He'd lived as a hero and died as a hero, and the 20 families now scattered across America were living proof that heroism could triumph over evil. But his story wasn't over yet. The evidence he'd collected, the network he'd built, and the lives he'd saved all depended on what happened next. Thomas had given everything to preserve the truth and protect the innocent. Now it was my turn to prove worthy of his sacrifice. The most precious artifact Klaus had saved from that terrible night was a collection of written testimonies from the survivors Thomas had rescued, their own words describing his final moments, recorded while their memories were still raw with grief and gratitude. Reading these accounts was like watching my husband's last heroic acts through the eyes of those whose lives he'd saved. Emma Kowalski, traveling with her 3 young children, had written her testimony in careful English just days after reaching safety in New York. When the fire started, everything was chaos. People screaming, smoke everywhere, children crying for their parents. But Mr. Sullivan appeared like an angel in the darkness. He wasn't panicked like the rest of us. He moved with purpose, like he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Her 8-year-old son Peter had added his own childish drawing to his mother's testimony, a crayon picture of a tall man in a suit helping people climb out of a burning airship. At the bottom, in carefully printed letters, he'd written, "The nice man saved us. He told me to be brave for Mama." Klaus had arranged these testimonies chronologically, creating a minute-by-minute account of Thomas's actions during the 34 seconds it took for the Hindenburg to crash and burn. The precision of their memories, despite the chaos they'd endured, spoke to the profound impact Thomas had made in those final moments. Dr. Heinrich Weber, a surgeon from Munich, traveling with his elderly parents, had provided the most detailed medical account. Sullivan moved through the burning passenger compartment with the calm efficiency of a battlefield medic. He assessed each person's condition instantly: who could walk, who needed assistance, who required immediate evacuation. His triage decisions saved lives that would have been lost to panic. The testimonies revealed that Thomas had done more than simply guide people to safety. He'd maintained their hope and dignity, even in the face of certain death. Several survivors mentioned that he'd taken time to comfort children, help elderly passengers maintain their footing, and reassure families that they would survive. "He told my daughter that American ice cream was worth living for," wrote Moses Rosenberg. "In the middle of an inferno, with death all around us, he was thinking about a child's future happiness. That is when I knew we would survive, because a man like that would not let us die." But it was the testimony of Captain Ernst Lehmann himself, dictated from his hospital bed before his own death, that revealed the true measure of Thomas's sacrifice. Klaus had obtained this account through contacts in the German-American community, who had visited Lehmann during his final days. The American passenger who saved so many lives, Sullivan, he found me trapped in the control car after my crew had evacuated. Lehmann had whispered to his visitors, "The aluminum framework was collapsing, hydrogen fires everywhere, and I was certain I would die there. But this man, this stranger, he pulled me from the wreckage knowing it would cost him his own escape." Lehmann's account provided crucial details about Thomas's final moments. After rescuing the captain, Thomas had attempted to reach one of the rear exits, but falling debris had blocked his path. Instead of panicking, he'd used his engineering knowledge to find an alternative route through the ship's maze of girders and fabric. He was calculating angles and load-bearing points even as the ship burned around us, Lehmann had testified. Professional to the end, using his mind to solve problems even when his body was failing. Multiple witnesses had seen Thomas reach the rear exit platform, but by then the ground was 40 feet below and the platform was engulfed in flames. He'd had 2 choices: jump and risk death from the fall, or wait for rescue personnel who might arrive too late. Sarah Cohen's testimony described Thomas's final decision. We were on the ground, safe because of him, but we could see him trapped. On the burning platform, my husband shouted for him to jump, that we would catch him somehow. But Mr. Sullivan shook his head. He pointed to something behind him, an other person, someone else who needed help. Thomas had chosen to stay with Johann Strauss, an elderly crew member who had been injured and couldn't jump on his own. Together, they'd waited for the ground crew's ladder. Thomas, using his own body to shield Strauss from the flames. Klaus' most treasured testimony came from Strauss himself, who had survived the crash and spent months recovering in an American hospital. That man, Sullivan, he held me steady while the fire burned all around us. He talked to me about his wife, about how much he loved her, about the good life they'd built together. He wasn't afraid, he was at peace. When the rescue ladder finally reached them, Thomas had insisted that Strauss go first. By the time Thomas began his own descent, the platform's support cables were failing. The ladder collapsed just as he reached the halfway point, sending him falling into the burning wreckage below. He never cried out. Strauss had written, even falling, even knowing he was going to die, he didn't make a sound. I think he didn't want to frighten the rest of us. Ground crew members had pulled Thomas from the wreckage still alive but critically injured. His last words, recorded by the medic who treated him, revealed his priorities even in his dying moments. The packages, tell Klaus, the packages were all delivered safely. Tell my wife I kept my promise. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the physician who treated Thomas at the scene, had written the final medical testimony. Patient sustained burns over 60% of his body and internal injuries consistent with impact trauma, remained conscious and coherent for approximately 20 minutes, repeatedly asking about the welfare of other passengers, demonstrated remarkable courage and concern for others despite his own critical condition. Thomas had died at 8:47 p.m. on May 6, 1937, exactly 1 hour and 22 minutes after the Hindenburg caught fire. But according to every witness, he'd spent his final moments not in self-pity or regret, but in gratitude that his mission had succeeded. The testimonies Klaus had preserved weren't just historical records. They were love letters to heroism itself, proof that one person's courage could illuminate the darkness for dozens of others. Thomas hadn't just saved 20 families from Nazi persecution, he'd shown them that goodness existed in the world, that strangers would risk everything to help them, that hope could survive even in humanity's darkest hours. Reading these accounts, I finally understood why Thomas had never told me about his work. It wasn't because he didn't trust me or because he thought me incapable of understanding. It was because he'd known that loving someone meant protecting them from unnecessary pain. And watching him risk his life repeatedly would have been agony. But now, I knew the truth, and the weight of that knowledge was both crushing and liberating. My husband had died a hero's death, but more importantly, he'd lived a hero's life. The man I'd mourned as a victim was actually one of history's most unlikely champions. The testimonies ended with a collective letter from all 20 families, written 6 months after their arrival in America. Thomas Sullivan gave us life twice, once when he rescued us from Germany, and once when he saved us from the flames. We will honor his memory by living the lives he made possible, by raising our children as Americans, and by never forgetting that freedom comes at a price paid by heroes. As I closed the folder containing these precious testimonies, I realized that Thomas's death had been the completion of his life's work, not its interruption. He'd died as he'd lived, putting others first, using his skills to solve problems, and refusing to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. But his story wasn't finished yet. The evidence he'd collected, the network he'd built, and the families he'd saved all depended on what happened next. Thomas had given his life to preserve truth and protect innocence. Now it was my responsibility to ensure his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Klaus arrived at my house 3 days after we'd read the survivor testimonies, carrying a manila envelope that would shatter my remaining illusions about my government's integrity. Inside were official documents he'd obtained through contacts in Washington, papers that revealed why Thomas's heroism had been deliberately erased from the historical record. The cover-up started within hours of the crash, Klaus explained. As we spread the documents across my kitchen table, someone in very high places decided that Thomas's story was too dangerous to tell. The first document was a classified memorandum from the State Department, dated May 8, 1937, just 2 days after the disaster. It was addressed to all relevant agencies and marked confidential. Destroy after reading. Subject: Hindenburg. Passenger: Thomas Sullivan. Information suppression required. The memo began. Investigation has revealed that passenger Sullivan was involved in unauthorized refugee assistance operations that could complicate ongoing diplomatic relations with German government. All references to Sullivan's heroic actions during evacuation must be removed from official reports. Media contacts have been briefed accordingly. My hands trembled as I read further. The memo specifically instructed investigators to minimize Thomas's role in saving lives, to avoid mentioning the 20 families he'd helped escape Germany, and to treat his death as simply another tragedy rather than an act of heroism. But why? I asked Klaus. What could they possibly gain by hiding the truth? The answer was in the next document, a confidential briefing prepared for President Roosevelt himself. The briefing, stamped eyes only, revealed the political calculations that had led to Thomas's erasure from history. Public knowledge of an extensive refugee rescue network operating without government approval could damage our carefully maintained neutrality regarding European affairs, the briefing stated. More significantly, exposure of American business connections to German policies could destabilize several major corporations, critical to our economic recovery efforts. Klaus pointed to a list attached to the briefing: American companies that had been secretly conducting business with Nazi Germany, including firms that had profited from the seizure of Jewish property. Several names on the list were major contributors, 2 political campaigns, and at least 3 had executives serving in government advisory positions. Thomas's evidence wasn't just documenting Nazi crimes, Klaus said grimly. It was exposing American complicity. People in Washington decided that protecting those business relationships was more important than honoring a hero. The most damning document was a letter from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to the Attorney General, dated May 15. The same day as Thomas's funeral. Hoover had written, "The Sullivan matter has been contained. All physical evidence of his refugee activities has been secured or destroyed. The network of accomplices is being monitored but not prosecuted, as arrests could draw unwanted attention to the operation's scope. Secured or destroyed." They'd been hunting Thomas's evidence from the beginning, not to expose Nazi crimes, but to prevent exposure of American cooperation with those crimes. Klaus had obtained these documents through Dr. Hayes, whose brother worked as a clerk in the State Department. It took months of careful investigation, Klaus explained. We had to be certain these were authentic before showing them to you. The papers revealed that the mysterious men in dark suits who'd attended Thomas's funeral hadn't been Nazi agents. Hunting his network, they'd been American intelligence operatives, making sure his story stayed buried. The phone calls I'd received, the sense of being watched, the families disappearing from their homes, all part of a systematic effort to eliminate evidence of Thomas's work. They couldn't simply arrest everyone, Klaus continued. Too many people knew pieces of the story. Instead, they decided to discredit the evidence and scatter the witnesses. A handwritten note attached to one of the memos made my blood boil with rage. Sullivan's widow appears unaware of husband's activities. Continue monitoring but take no action unless she demonstrates knowledge of network operations. They'd been watching me for months, waiting to see if I would discover Thomas's secrets. Every condolence visit, every phone call, every moment of my grief had been observed and analyzed by people who saw my husband's heroism as a threat to national security. The final document in Klaus's collection was perhaps the most heartbreaking letter from Secretary of State Cordell Hull to the German ambassador, expressing regret about the unfortunate refugee assistance activities that had been conducted without official approval, and promising that such operations would not be tolerated in the future. They apologized to the Nazis, I whispered, unable to believe what I was reading. They apologized for Thomas saving innocent lives. Klaus nodded sadly. The official position became that Thomas was a well-meaning but misguided individual who had acted without authorization. His heroism during the crash was acknowledged privately but never publicized, and his refugee work was classified as illegal immigration assistance. The documents revealed that several other network members had been quietly arrested in the months following the crash, charged with minor immigration violations that carried short sentences but effectively silenced them. Dr. Hayes had avoided prosecution only because his medical license made him too visible, and Father O'Brien had been protected by his position in the Catholic Church. But the families Thomas saved, I said. What happened to them? Scattered across the country under new identities, threatened with deportation if they spoke about their experiences. The government's position was that they'd entered the country through illegal channels and should be grateful for permission to stay. Klaus showed me a list of the 20 families, annotated with their current status. Some had indeed disappeared completely, relocated so far from their original destinations that even the network had lost contact with them. Others had been intimidated into silence, their children forbidden from speaking about their European origins. The Rosenberg family changed their name to Roberts and moved to Oregon. Klaus read from his notes. The Cohens became the Collins and settled in rural Montana. Each family was given a choice: stay silent about Thomas's work or face deportation back to Germany. The systematicness of the cover-up was breathtaking in its cruelty. Thomas had died saving these people, and the government had responded by threatening them with the very fate he'd sacrificed his life to prevent. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked Klaus. "Because the situation is changing," he replied. "War is coming. Everyone in Washington knows it, even if they won't admit it publicly. When America finally enters the fight against Nazi Germany, Thomas's evidence could be crucial for prosecuting war crimes, but only if it survives long enough to matter." The documents Klaus had brought revealed that the cover-up had been temporary, designed to maintain neutrality while America prepared for the inevitable conflict. Several memos referenced post-war accountability and the need to preserve evidence while maintaining current diplomatic fiction. Thomas was ahead of his time, Klaus concluded. He saw what was coming and acted when action could still save lives. The government chose political expediency over moral courage, but they knew they might need his evidence eventually. As I stared at the official stamps and classified markings that had been used to bury my husband's heroism, I felt anger replacing grief for the first time since his death. Thomas had given everything to save innocent lives and preserve evidence of humanity's darkest crimes. In return, his own government had erased his memory and threatened the people he'd died to protect. But the documents also revealed something else. The cover-up had been incomplete. Thomas's evidence had been too well hidden, his network too carefully constructed, his families too widely scattered for complete suppression. Somewhere in the maze of bureaucratic compromise and political calculation, his truth had survived. The question now was whether I had the courage to do what my government had refused to do: honor Thomas's memory by ensuring his evidence reached the world, regardless of the political consequences. Looking at Klaus across my kitchen table, surrounded by proof of official betrayal and bureaucratic cowardice, I made the decision Thomas would have wanted me to make. "Tell me how to contact the families," I said. "It's time to bring Thomas's evidence out of hiding." The address book Klaus had helped me decode became my most precious possession, a roadmap to finding the 20 families whose lives Thomas had saved and whose stories the government had tried to bury. Each address represented not just a location, but a piece of my husband's legacy, scattered across America like seeds waiting to grow into something beautiful. The first family I contacted was the Brennans, in New York City. I'd remembered Mr. Brennan from his visit to my home, his kind eyes, and the $20 he'd left in gratitude. When I called the telephone number listed in Thomas's book, Mrs. Brennan answered with a voice full of warmth that immediately turned to concern when I identified myself. "Margaret, dear," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "We've been so worried about you. We heard that people were asking questions, government men looking for Thomas's friends." Klaus and I took the train to New York the following week, carrying copies of the survivor testimonies and some of the evidence we'd found at the Stoltzfus farm. The Brennan apartment was small but immaculate, filled with photographs of grandchildren and the warm smell of fresh bread that reminded me of my own grandmother's kitchen. David Brennan, now in his 70s, wept openly when he saw the testimonies from the Hindenburg crash. "I knew Thomas was a hero," he said, his accent still carrying traces of his Bavarian origins, "but I never knew how much he sacrificed for us." Mrs. Brennan showed me a wooden box they'd kept on their mantelpiece since arriving in America. Inside were the identification papers Thomas had created for them, their original tickets for passage to America, and a photograph of the 3 generations of their family who had escaped Germany together. 23 people in our family lived because of your husband," she explained. "My sons, their wives, my grandchildren, none of them would exist if Thomas hadn't brought us to safety. But it was their youngest grandson, 8-year-old Michael, who provided the most moving tribute to Thomas's legacy. He'd been born in America to parents who spoke of Thomas Sullivan with reverence, usually reserved for saints. To Michael, Thomas wasn't a historical figure, he was the guardian angel who had made his existence possible. "My mama says the nice man died so I could be born here," Michael told me in his clear, unaccented English. "She says I have to be extra good because I'm living the life he gave me." The Brennans had prospered in America despite the government's attempts to silence them. David had found work as a watchmaker, using skills learned in his father's shop in Munich. Their sons had served in the American military, and their daughter was studying to become a teacher. They'd built exactly the kind of life Thomas had envisioned for the families he saved, but they'd also lived in constant fear of discovery. "We changed our name from Brenner to Brennan," David explained. "We told our children never to speak German in public, never to mention how we came to America. The government men made it clear that our safety depended on our silence." Klaus and I visited 6 more families over the following months, each reunion more emotional than the last. The co in Detroit had become the Kellys, running a small grocery store that served their Polish American neighborhood. Emma Kelly still kept Thomas's farewell letter in her purse, the one he'd written to her children, explaining why he couldn't come visit them in America as he'd promised. The Rosenbergs, now the Roberts family in Portland, had built a successful lumber business and sent all 3 of their children to college. Moses Roberts had framed the drawing his son Peter had made of Thomas saving them from the burning airship, and it hung in their living room beside family photographs and their naturalization certificates. Each family had preserved something from their journey: a letter from Thomas, a photograph from the ship, a piece of identification he'd created for them. Together, these artifacts told the complete story of Operation Phoenix and the network that had made their freedom possible. But it was the Cohen family, now living as the Cohens in Chicago, who held the most significant piece of Thomas's legacy. Sarah Collins had kept every letter Thomas had written to them during their months of hiding in Germany, and these letters revealed the full scope of his courage and planning. "He wasn't just rescuing us randomly," Sarah explained as she showed me the correspondence. "Thomas had identified families who were most at risk: intellectuals, professionals, people who could contribute to America but who would be first targets for persecution." The letters revealed Thomas's systematic approach to the refugee operation. He'd studied Nazi policies, identified vulnerable populations, and created detailed evacuation plans that accounted for everything from travel documents to housing arrangements in America. One letter, written just weeks before the Hindenburg flight, showed Thomas's growing urgency. "The situation is deteriorating faster than anyone anticipated. Mass arrests have begun in Vienna, and there are rumors of much worse to come. This may be our last opportunity to save lives on this scale." David Collins, who had been a prominent lawyer in Berlin, had used his legal knowledge to help other refugees navigate American immigration procedures. His wife Sarah had become a social worker, specializing in helping displaced persons adapt to American life. Their children, now grown, had no memory of Germany but carried their parents' gratitude for Thomas's sacrifice. "We named our youngest son Thomas," Sarah told me, tears streaming down her face. "We wanted to make sure his name lived on, even if the government tried to erase his memory." As Klaus and I compiled the stories and artifacts from each family, a remarkable pattern emerged. The 20 families Thomas had saved had become productive, patriotic Americans who contributed far more to their adopted country than they'd ever taken from it. They'd started businesses, served in the military, raised children who became doctors and teachers and engineers. Thomas hadn't just saved 20 families, had saved the future generations those families would create, the innovations they would contribute, the lives they would touch in ways that rippled forward through time. The address book contained one final entry that had puzzled Klaus and me: a location in rural Pennsylvania listed simply as the repository, final contact. When we visited the address, we found a small farm owned by an elderly Quaker couple named Jonathan and Ruth Hartman. Ruth Hartman invited us in for tea and immediately produced a large wooden chest from her bedroom closet. "Thomas asked us to keep this safe," she explained. "He said if anything happened to him, someone would come looking for it eventually." The chest contained copies of every document Thomas had compiled about Nazi persecution, every photograph he'd taken, every piece of evidence he'd gathered during his years of dangerous work, but more importantly, it contained letters from all 20 families. written after their arrival in America, and expressing their gratitude for the life Thomas had given them. He wanted proof, Ruth Hartman explained, not just of the crimes he'd documented, but of the good that came from stopping them. These letters show what happens when one person chooses courage over comfort. Reading those letters, I finally understood the true scope of Thomas's achievement. He hadn't just saved lives, he'd preserved hope itself, proving that individual actions could triumph over institutional evil. That love was stronger than hate, that heroes could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. The last letter in the collection was addressed to me, written in Thomas's handwriting and dated just before his departure for Germany. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then my mission has succeeded and you have found the families who will remember me with love. I hope you can forgive me for the secrets I kept. I hope you can understand that everything I did was motivated by love for you, love for humanity, love for the idea that good people must act when evil threatens the innocent. These families are my legacy, but you are my heart. Live well, my darling. Live the life I died to preserve. Sitting in the Hartmans' quiet farmhouse, surrounded by evidence of my husband's heroism and the gratitude of those he'd saved, I finally found peace with Thomas's death. He hadn't been taken from me by cruel fate or random tragedy. He'd chosen to give his life for others, and that choice had created something beautiful that would endure long after the pain of loss had faded. The 20 families Thomas saved had become 20 American success stories, proof that heroism could triumph over hatred and that one person's courage could change the world. Over the course of a year, Klaus and I gathered the complete stories of all 20 families Thomas had saved, and each tale was a testament to the ripple effect of his heroism. What had begun as a rescue mission had become something far more profound, demonstration of how one person's courage could reshape the future in ways that extended far beyond the original act of mercy. The thank you letters we collected weren't just expressions of gratitude, they were documentation of lives lived in honor of Thomas's sacrifice. Each family had not only survived, but thrived, creating new chapters of the American story that wouldn't have existed without my husband's intervention. Dr. Heinrich Weber, the surgeon from Munich, had become one of New York's most respected physicians, specializing in treating refugees and displaced persons without charge. His letter described how Thomas's example had inspired him to dedicate his medical practice to helping others who had lost everything. Your husband saved my body from the flames, but more importantly, he saved my soul from despair. Every life I help heal is a tribute to his memory. The Weber family's contribution to America was already extraordinary. Dr. Weber's son had become a research scientist working on treatments for tuberculosis, and his daughter was studying law with plans to work on immigration cases. His elderly parents, whom Thomas had personally carried to safety, had lived to see their great-grandchildren born as American citizens. Emma Kowalski, now Emma Kelly, had used her experience as a refugee to become an advocate for other displaced persons. Her letter revealed that she'd helped more than 200 families navigate American immigration procedures, often using her own money to pay for legal assistance and translation services. Thomas taught me that when you have been saved, you have an obligation to save others. I try to honor that lesson every day. Her 3 children had all excelled in their adopted country. Peter, the little boy who'd drawn pictures of Thomas rescuing them from the burning airship, had grown up to become an engineer like his hero. He was working on designs for safer aircraft, inspired by the tragedy that had taken Thomas's life but spared his own. The Rosenberg family's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. Moses Roberts had used his experience in the textile business to build a clothing company that employed dozens of other immigrants, but more significantly, he'd established a scholarship fund for refugee children, ensuring that others would have the educational opportunities Thomas's sacrifice had made possible for his own family. We cannot repay the debt we owe to your husband, Moses wrote, but we can pass his gift forward to others who need what he gave us: hope, opportunity, and the chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. His eldest son had become a teacher, his daughter a nurse, and his youngest boy was studying to become a rabbi, inspired by the belief that saving one life was equivalent to saving the entire world. The Rosenberg family tree now included 15 people who existed because Thomas had risked everything to bring 3 refugees to safety. The Cohen family had perhaps honored Thomas most directly by dedicating their lives to preserving the truth he'd died to protect. David Collins had used his legal training to document war crimes and advocate for international justice, while Sarah had become a writer, recording the testimonies of Holocaust survivors who were beginning to reach America in growing numbers. Their letter included a manuscript. Sarah was preparing a comprehensive account of Thomas's refugee network and the evidence he'd collected. "Someone must tell the complete story," she wrote. "The world needs to know that heroes existed, that good people fought back, that evil did not triumph without resistance." But it was the stories of the children, those who had been young when Thomas saved them and who had grown up American, that most clearly demonstrated the lasting impact of his sacrifice. Little Rachel Cohen, who had been 3 years old during the Hindenburg flight, was now studying medicine at Johns Hopkins University. She'd kept the small doll Thomas had given her during the voyage, and it sat on her desk as she studied, a reminder of the man who had made her American education possible. Michael Brennan, the youngest grandson of the elderly couple Thomas had rescued, had written his own letter despite being only 8 years old. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan, my grandpa says, your husband was the bravest man who ever lived. When I grow up, I want to be brave like him and help people who are scared. Thank you for sharing him with us." Each letter revealed not just individual success but collective transformation. The 20 families had become integrated into American society while maintaining their cultural heritage and their memory of Thomas's sacrifice. They'd started businesses that employed hundreds of people, served in the American military during the war that was now raging in Europe, and raised children who thought of themselves as Americans first, but who carried the knowledge that their existence was a gift from a hero. The mathematical impact was staggering. 20 families had become nearly 200 people across 3 generations. Children who wouldn't have been born, innovations that wouldn't have been created, lives that wouldn't have been touched by these survivors and their descendants. Thomas's 34 seconds of heroism on the burning Hindenburg had created an entire alternative timeline of human potential. But the letters revealed something else. Every family had established their own tradition of service, their own way of honoring Thomas's memory by helping others. The Kowalskis funded a soup kitchen in Detroit. The Rosenbergs had built a community center that provided services to new immigrants. The Cohens had established a legal aid clinic for refugees. Dr. Weber's letter included a remarkable revelation. "Your husband's example inspired us to create our own rescue network. During the past 3 years, we have helped 67 additional families escape from Europe. We call it Operation Sullivan. And every person we save learns the story of the man who taught us that courage is contagious." Klaus had been right when he'd told me that Thomas was part of something larger than a simple rescue operation. His heroism had planted seeds that continued to grow, creating new networks of compassion that extended his influence far beyond the original 20 families. The final letter in our collection came from a source I hadn't expected. The crew of the Hindenburg who had survived the crash. Captain Prussian, who had recovered from his injuries, had written from Germany to express his gratitude for Thomas's actions during the disaster. Even more remarkably, he'd included letters from the families of crew members Thomas had saved, including the elderly Johann Strauss, whose life Thomas had protected during those final moments on the burning platform. "Your husband died as he lived, thinking of others before himself," Captain Prussian wrote. "He was the finest example of American character I have ever witnessed. His courage in those final moments inspired my crew to acts of heroism they didn't know they possessed." As Klaus and I compiled these letters into a complete collection, I realized we weren't just documenting Thomas's impact, we were creating a new kind of historical record. These weren't the sterile accounts typically found in government files or newspaper reports. They were intimate, personal testimonies to the way individual heroism could reshape the world one life at a time. The 20 families Thomas saved had become living monuments to his memory, their successes and contributions serving as proof that heroism was an investment in the future rather than simply a noble gesture in the present. Every child they raised, every innovation they contributed, every act of service they performed was a dividend paid by Thomas's courage. Reading these letters, I finally understood why Thomas had been willing to risk everything for strangers. He hadn't just been saving lives, he'd been saving the future itself, ensuring that the best of humanity would survive to fight another day against the forces of hatred and evil. The thank you letters were more than expressions of gratitude. They were proof that love was indeed stronger than hate, that courage could triumph over cruelty, and that one person's choice to act could echo through generations in ways that transformed the world. Hidden in the secret compartment where I'd found Thomas's false passport was one final letter I'd somehow missed during my initial search. Shiza, envelope marked for Margaret's heart in his careful handwriting. Klaus discovered it while helping me organize the evidence we'd collected, and when he handed it to me, I knew immediately that this was Thomas's real goodbye, the words he'd wanted me to find when I was ready to understand his choices. The envelope was sealed with wax, and breaking it felt like opening a door I'd been afraid to walk through for months. Inside were 3 pages of Thomas's most intimate thoughts, written in the weeks before his final departure, when he'd known the growing dangers of his work but couldn't abandon the people who depended on him. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth about our marriage. Not that I deceived you about my love, which was always completely real, but that I deceived you about my life, which was far more complicated than I ever wanted it to be." The letter revealed the internal struggle Thomas had faced throughout our marriage, torn between his desire to be completely honest with me and his need to protect me from the dangerous reality of his work. He'd understood that loving someone sometimes meant carrying burdens alone, making sacrifices they would never know about, and accepting the loneliness that came with keeping necessary secrets. "I know you must feel betrayed by my silence," he continued, "but I need you to understand that every secret I kept was an act of love, not the selfish kind of love that demands complete sharing, but the protective kind that asks what serves the beloved best. Sometimes love means telling everything. Sometimes it means telling nothing. I chose the path that kept you safe, even though it meant I had to carry the weight alone." Thomas's words revealed the depth of his internal conflict. He'd wanted to share his work with me, to have my support and understanding. But he'd also known that knowledge would have made me a target. The letter described sleepless nights when he'd lain beside me, watching me sleep peacefully while he wrestled with decisions that could mean life or death for dozens of people. "You asked me once why I sometimes seemed distant, why I would stare out the window with such sadness. It wasn't because I didn't love you, it was because I loved you so much that I couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to you because of my choices. Every family I saved made my work more dangerous, but also made it more necessary to continue." The letter explained why Thomas had never told me about his real identity or his mission in Germany. It wasn't because he thought me weak or untrustworthy, but because he'd understood that true love sometimes required unequal sacrifice. He'd chosen to bear the full weight of his dangerous work alone so that I could continue living the normal, peaceful life we'd built together. "I watched you in the kitchen each morning, humming while you prepared breakfast, and I thought about how much joy there was in that simple moment," he wrote. "You were happy, Margaret. You trusted the world we'd created together, and destroying that trust even for the sake of honesty seemed cruel when I could carry the burden myself." But the letter also revealed Thomas's growing awareness that his work was becoming too dangerous to continue indefinitely. He'd planned the Hindenburg mission as his final operation, intending to retire from the refugee network and finally tell me everything once the last families were safe. "After this trip, I was going to confess everything," he admitted. "I was going to tell you about Heinrich Müller, about the families I'd helped, about the evidence I'd collected. I was going to ask your forgiveness for the deception and your help in deciding what to do with the documentation I'd gathered. I wanted us to face the future together, with no more secrets between us." The letter described his plan for our life after his retirement from the network. We would have moved to a small town where no one knew our history, started fresh with complete honesty between us, and perhaps raised children who would grow up knowing their father as simply a man who'd once helped people in need. I dreamed of showing you the letters from the families I'd saved, of sharing their joy and gratitude with the woman I loved most. I imagined us growing old together, visiting the children and grandchildren of people whose lives I'd touched, seeing the good that had grown from seeds planted in darkness. But Thomas had also understood that his work carried the possibility of ultimate sacrifice, and the letter revealed his preparations for that eventuality. He'd hidden evidence carefully, not just to protect it from enemies, but to ensure that I would eventually find it and understand his choices. "If I don't return from this mission, I need you to know that my death, if death it is, will not be meaningless. Every family I've saved will live because of what happens on this trip. Their children will grow up free, their talents will enrich America, their stories will be proof that good can triumph over evil." The most moving passage came near the end, where Thomas addressed his fear that I might feel our entire marriage had been built on lies. You might wonder if the man you married was real, if Thomas Sullivan ever truly existed, or if you were simply living with Heinrich Müller's performance. Let me tell you the truth. Thomas Sullivan was the most real I ever was. Heinrich Müller was the identity I was born with, but Thomas Sullivan was the man I chose to become. Every morning I woke up beside you. Every evening we spent talking about our dreams. Every moment of laughter and tenderness we shared, that was the truest version of myself. He explained that marrying me had actually made his rescue work more meaningful, not less. Loving me had taught him about the preciousness of simple happiness, the importance of protecting innocent joy, the way individual connections could make abstract concepts like freedom and safety feel urgently personal. When I helped families escape persecution, I thought of you sleeping safely in our bed. When I forged documents to give someone a new identity, I remembered how you'd given me a new life simply by loving me. When I risked everything to save strangers, I was protecting the world that made our love possible. The letter concluded with words that finally allowed me to forgive him for his secrecy. I know you may feel angry about the deception, and you have every right to that anger. But I need you to understand that I kept these secrets not because I didn't trust you, but because I completely trusted you to build a beautiful life, even without knowing all the darkness I was fighting against. Trusted you to love the best parts of me even while I struggled with the worst parts of the world. You made me a better man, Margaret. Not just a happier one, but a braver one, a more compassionate one, a man worthy of the love you gave me. If I die on this mission, I die knowing that I experienced the greatest happiness possible, being completely loved by someone who saw the best version of myself, even when I couldn't see it myself. The final paragraph brought me to tears. Don't mourn Heinrich Müller, who was born into darkness and spent his life fighting against it. Mourn Thomas Sullivan, who was born when you first smiled at me in that Philadelphia diner, who lived every day in the light of your love, and who died believing that the world was worth saving because it contained people like you. I love you, beyond words, beyond time, beyond death itself. Live well, my darling. Live the life that our love made possible. As I finished reading, Klaus reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He was protecting you the only way he knew how, he said gently. I realized that Thomas's letter had given me the one thing I'd been searching for since discovering his secrets. Permission to forgive him for keeping them. He hadn't been lying to me about love. He'd been loving me so completely that he'd carried all the darkness alone to keep our world bright. The man I'd married had been real. Thomas Sullivan had existed in every kiss, every laugh, every quiet evening we'd spent planning our future together. Heinrich Müller had been the identity that carried out dangerous work, but Thomas Sullivan had been the heart that came home to me each night. Reading his final love letter, I finally understood that Thomas's greatest act of heroism hadn't been saving 20 families from the Hindenburg crash. It had been loving me completely, while keeping me safe from the terrible knowledge that could have destroyed our happiness. He'd given me the gift of innocent joy for 3 years, and then given his life to preserve a world where such joy was possible. That wasn't deception, it was the most profound expression of love I could imagine. 2 years after discovering the truth about Thomas's heroism, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible during those dark months of grief and confusion. On May 6, 1939, the second anniversary of the Hindenburg disaster, organized a private memorial service to honor my husband's real legacy and bring together the families whose lives he'd saved. The memorial garden stone I'd commissioned was simple but profound. A granite marker engraved with Thomas's name, his dates of birth and death, and the words he saved 20 families and preserved the truth. But more importantly, it included a small phoenix rising from flames, the symbol Thomas had used in his coded journals to mark his most significant accomplishments. Klaus had helped me contact all 20 families, and remarkably, representatives from 18 of them were able to travel to Philadelphia for the ceremony. Seeing them gathered together in Fairmount Park, 3 generations of people whose existence depended on Thomas's courage, was overwhelming in the most beautiful way possible. Dr. Weber, now in his 70s but still practicing medicine, had traveled from New York with his son and daughter. Emma Kelly had brought her 3 children, now young adults starting families of their own. The Roberts family had come from Oregon, and the Collins family from Chicago. Each group represented not just Thomas's individual rescues, but the expanding circles of life that had grown from his sacrifice. Little Michael Brennan, now 10 years old, had prepared a speech for the occasion. Standing beside Thomas's memorial stone with his hand on the granite surface, he spoke with the solemnity of someone who understood the weight of what he was commemorating. Mr. Sullivan gave us the most important gift, the chance to be Americans. My grandpa says that being saved isn't just about not dying, it's about getting to live all the life you were supposed to have. Mr. Sullivan gave that to all of us. Father O'Brien conducted the service, reading from the book of Isaiah, "Here am I, send me." It was the same passage Thomas had quoted in one of his letters to the refugee families, explaining why he felt called to help strangers despite the personal risk. Hearing those words spoken over his memorial, I realized they perfectly captured the essence of who Thomas had been, someone who responded to need with action rather than hesitation. But the most moving part of the ceremony came when each family placed a stone on Thomas's memorial, a Jewish tradition that Dr. Weber had suggested. As the pile of stones grew, representing the collective gratitude of dozens of people, I saw Thomas's legacy transformed from private grief into shared remembrance. Sarah Collins read aloud from the manuscript she'd been writing about Thomas's network and the evidence he'd collected. Her words painted a picture of a man who'd understood that individual actions could change the course of history, that ordinary people could choose to become heroes when circumstances demanded extraordinary courage. Thomas Sullivan saw evil and chose to fight it, she read. He saw suffering and chose to alleviate it. He saw families in danger and chose to save them. He saw truth being buried and chose to preserve it. In an age when many good people chose to look away, Thomas chose to look directly at darkness and work to overcome it. The Kowalski family had brought a special gift, a handmade quilt created by Emma and her daughters, featuring 20 squares representing each rescued family. In the center was an embroidered phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by symbols representing the lives Thomas had made possible, wedding rings for the marriages that occurred in freedom, graduation caps for the educations his sacrifice had enabled, baby rattles for the children born in safety. Moses Roberts spoke for all the families when he addressed me directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, your husband gave us life, but you've given us something equally precious, the knowledge that our survival had meaning, that our gratitude has been preserved, that our children will know the name of the man who made their existence possible." As the ceremony concluded, Klaus presented me with a final surprise, a letter from President Roosevelt himself, acknowledging Thomas's heroism and expressing regret that political considerations had prevented earlier recognition. The president's words carried special weight because they represented official acknowledgement of what the government had tried to suppress. Thomas Sullivan embodied the highest ideals of American citizenship: courage in the face of danger, compassion for the suffering, and commitment to justice, regardless of personal cost. His sacrifice reminds us that freedom is preserved not just by armies and governments, but by individuals willing to risk everything for their fellow human beings. The memorial service had been intended as a way to honor Thomas's memory, but it became something more significant, a celebration of the ongoing impact of his heroism. The families he'd saved hadn't just survived, they'd thrived, contributed, and created new generations of Americans whose talents and achievements were part of Thomas's legacy. Dr. Weber announced that the medical clinic he'd established for refugees would be renamed the Thomas Sullivan Center for Displaced Persons. The Roberts family pledged to fund a scholarship program for immigrant children. The Collins family planned to donate Thomas's evidence to the Library of Congress, ensuring that his documentation of Nazi crimes would be preserved for history. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from young Peter Kelly, Emma's eldest son, who had grown up to become an engineer, inspired by Thomas's example. He announced his intention to volunteer for military service when America inevitably entered the war against Nazi Germany. "Mr. Sullivan fought evil with compassion," Peter said. "Now it's our turn to fight evil with whatever weapons we have." His courage taught us that good people can't stand by while bad things happen. As I watched the families dispersing after the ceremony, carrying Thomas's memory back to their scattered communities across America, I realized that the memorial stone we'd unveiled was just a symbol. The real memorial to Thomas's legacy was walking around, living and breathing and contributing to the world. 20 families, whose survival had created ripples of goodness that would continue expanding for generations. The memorial garden stone would weather and fade eventually, but the lives Thomas had saved would continue creating new life, new hope, new proof that individual heroism could triumph over institutional evil. He'd planted seeds of courage that were still growing, still bearing fruit, still demonstrating that love was indeed stronger than hate. Standing in the quiet garden as the sun set on our memorial service, I felt at peace with Thomas's choices. For the first time since learning the truth about his secret life, he'd died as he'd lived, putting others before himself, choosing hope over fear, proving that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when guided by love and courage. The memorial stone bore his name, but his real monument was the living legacy of the people whose lives he'd touched, whose children would grow up free because one man had chosen to be a hero when heroism was desperately needed. The months following Thomas's memorial service marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where grief gradually transformed into purpose, where loss became the foundation for meaningful action. I'd spent 2 years learning who my husband really was. Now, it was time to decide who I wanted to become in response to that knowledge. The new wedding ring I'd commissioned was subtle but significant, a simple gold band engraved with a tiny phoenix, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. I wore it on my right hand, not as a replacement for my original wedding ring, but as a symbol of the woman I was becoming, someone who honored the past while embracing the future, someone who could carry Thomas's memory without being imprisoned by grief. Klaus had suggested that I consider joining the network that was continuing Thomas's work, but I'd found a different calling. The families Thomas had saved needed ongoing support as they built their American lives, and I'd discovered I had both the emotional capacity and the practical skills to help them navigate challenges that other social workers couldn't understand. My first client was Maria Kowalski, Emma's youngest daughter, who was struggling with nightmares about the journey from Germany, despite being only 5 years old when it occurred. Traditional therapy hadn't helped because Maria couldn't explain her fears to people who'd never experienced such trauma. But when I sat with her and showed her photographs of Thomas, when I told her the complete story of how he'd saved her family, her healing finally began. "The nice man really did keep us safe," she whispered, studying the picture of Thomas helping passengers evacuate the Hindenburg. "Even when the fire was scary, he made sure Mama and Papa got out." Working with the children and grandchildren of Thomas's rescued families gave me a sense of purpose I'd never experienced as simply a grieving widow. These weren't just clients, they were living extensions of my husband's legacy. Young people whose very existence proved that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. Dr. Weber had established the Thomas Sullivan Center for Displaced Persons in a converted brownstone in Manhattan, and I'd begun volunteering there twice a week. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding, helping refugees navigate American bureaucracy, translating documents, providing emotional support to families who'd lost everything except each other. But perhaps more importantly, I'd become the keeper of Thomas's story, the person responsible for ensuring that his example continued to inspire action rather than simply admiration. When new refugees arrived at the center, frightened and uncertain about their future in America, I would tell them about Thomas, about how one man's courage had saved 20 families, about how those families had gone on to build remarkable lives, about how their own survival could become the foundation for helping others. The work connected me to Thomas in ways that Morden never could. Every family I helped felt like a continuation of his mission, every success story, another chapter in the legacy he'd begun. When the Petrov family finally received their immigration papers, when young Samuel Rosenberg graduated from medical school, when the elderly Mrs. Chen found her daughter who'd been lost during the chaos of leaving China, all of these victories felt like gifts Thomas was still giving to the world. Klaus had become more than just a fellow keeper of Thomas's memory. He'd become my closest friend and collaborator in the work of preserving what Thomas had started. Together, we'd established a private foundation that provided emergency assistance to refugees, funded by donations from the families Thomas had saved and administered through the Thomas Sullivan Center. "Thomas would be proud of what you've built," Klaus told me one evening as we reviewed applications for assistance grants. "He saved 20 families, but you're helping hundreds." The foundation work had also put me in contact with other networks operating across America, people who were continuing the rescue operations that Thomas had helped pioneer. The war in Europe was escalating, and the need for such work was becoming more urgent every month. While I couldn't participate in the dangerous overseas missions that Thomas had undertaken, I could provide support for those who did. My house on Maple Street had become an unofficial headquarters for refugee assistance. In Philadelphia, the spare bedroom that Thomas had used as his study was now filled with files on families seeking reunification, correspondence with immigration officials, and resources for people starting new lives in America. The space that had once hidden his secrets now openly celebrated his legacy. But the most significant change in my life was the relationship I'd begun building with Thomas's surviving network members. Father O'Brien had introduced me to other clergy members who were involved in refugee assistance. Dr. Hayes had connected me with medical professionals who provided free care to displaced persons. Mrs. Vasquez had shown me how to use her grocery store as a distribution center for emergency supplies. I'd become part of something larger than my individual grief, a community of people dedicated to proving that Thomas's example could inspire ongoing action rather than simply historical remembrance. We met monthly in the basement of St. Mary's, sharing information about families in need, coordinating responses to new crises, and ensuring that Thomas's network continued operating even without his direct leadership. The work wasn't without personal cost. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about families I couldn't help, bureaucratic obstacles I couldn't overcome, and the limitations of individual action in the face of systematic persecution. But there were also moments of profound joy, watching a child take her first steps in America, seeing a father reunited with sons he'd thought were dead, witnessing the gradual transformation of fear into hope in people who'd believed they would never be safe again. Most importantly, the work had given me a way to honor Thomas's memory that felt active rather than passive. Instead of simply mourning what I'd lost, I was building on what he'd created. Instead of being defined by his secrets, I was extending his mission of truth-telling and life-saving. The new wedding ring on my right hand caught the light as I worked at my desk each evening, processing applications and writing letters on behalf of people who needed advocates. It reminded me that love could take many forms: the romantic love I'd shared with Thomas, the protective love he'd shown to strangers, and the purposeful love I was learning to extend to people whose stories intersected with his legacy. Thomas had taught me that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about choosing compassion over comfort, action over inaction, hope over despair, day after day, until those choices became the defining characteristics of a life well lived. I was learning to live such a life, not in spite of losing Thomas, but because of everything he'd taught me about the power of individual courage to change the world. 3 years have passed since Klaus first appeared at my door with Thomas's impossible letter, and as I sit in my study completing the manuscript that will preserve his story for history, I understand now that discovering the truth about my husband was only the beginning of a longer journey toward understanding what it means to love someone completely. The complete story manuscript I've written fills 300 pages and contains every detail I've uncovered about Thomas's double life, his heroic mission, and the 20 families whose lives he saved. But more than that, it's become my attempt to reconcile the man I married with the hero I discovered, to prove that they were the same person, that love and courage weren't contradictory forces in his life, but complementary ones. Thomas Sullivan was real, not just the identity he assumed when he came to America, but the man who emerged when Heinrich Müller allowed himself to be loved completely. Every morning he woke up beside me, every evening we spent planning our future, every moment of tenderness we shared. Those weren't performances by someone playing a role. They were the truest expressions of who he became when he allowed himself to experience the peace and joy that his dangerous work was designed to protect. Writing his story has helped me understand that Thomas's greatest achievement wasn't saving 20 families from Nazi persecution. Remarkable though that was, his greatest achievement was proving that it was possible to live multiple truths simultaneously, to be a loving husband and a resistance fighter, a quiet engineer and a daring spy, a man who cherished domestic happiness and one who risked everything for strangers. The manuscript contains every document, every photograph, every testimony I've collected over these 3 years of investigation, but it also contains something more personal: my own transformation from a woman defined by loss to one empowered by purpose. Thomas's legacy lives not just in the families he saved, but in the person I became when I chose to honor his memory through action rather than mourning. Klaus has been instrumental in helping me complete this record. His memories of Thomas's final mission, his connections to the refugee network, and his friendship during the darkest period of my grief have made this manuscript possible. More importantly, he's helped me understand that preserving Thomas's story isn't just about historical accuracy, it's about inspiration. People need to know that heroes existed, Klaus told me as I finished the final chapter. In years to come, when the full horror of what's happening in Europe becomes known, people will need proof that good people fought back, that evil didn't triumph without resistance. The manuscript documents not just Thomas Goldsmith's family's hidden storage. All of these people proved that heroism could take many forms, that resistance could be waged by teachers and shopkeepers and farmers as effectively as by soldiers and spies. But the heart of the manuscript is the love story, not just the romance between Thomas and me, but the broader story of how love motivated every aspect of his dangerous work. He saved families because he understood what it meant to love and be loved. He risked his life for strangers because his experience of marital happiness had taught him how precious such bonds were for others. The 20 families Thomas rescued have continued to prosper in ways that validate every risk he took to save them. Dr. Weber's son has become a leading researcher in treatments for tuberculosis. Emma Kelly's daughter is studying to become a teacher. The Roberts children have started a lumber business that employs dozens of other immigrants. Each success story is proof that Thomas's sacrifice purchased something valuable, not just survival, but the opportunity to contribute, to create, to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. The most remarkable development has been the emergence of a second generation of heroes among the children Thomas saved. Young Peter Kelly has enlisted in the Army Air Corps, inspired by Thomas's example to fight fascism directly. Sarah Collins's son is studying law with plans to work on war crimes prosecution. The Brennan grandchildren have established their own charitable foundation to help refugee children. Thomas's heroism created a ripple effect that continues expanding, touching lives he never met, inspiring actions he never witnessed, proving that individual courage can indeed change the course of history. The 20 families he saved have become 20 fountains of compassion, each one helping others in ways that honor his memory and extend his mission. As I prepare to submit this manuscript to publishers, I'm aware that it will likely be years before the full truth about Nazi persecution becomes widely accepted, before the evidence Thomas collected is recognized as prophetic rather than alarmist. But I also know that truth has its own power, that preserved stories eventually find their audiences, that heroes are eventually honored even when their heroism was initially hidden. The man I married was indeed more than I knew, but he was also exactly who I thought he was: someone capable of profound love, extraordinary courage, and unwavering commitment to protecting what mattered most. Heinrich Müller was the identity that allowed him to save lives, but Thomas Sullivan was the heart that made those lives worth saving. I understand now that our marriage wasn't diminished by his secrets, but enriched by his sacrifices. He carried the darkness alone so that our love could exist in the light. He risked his life repeatedly so that our dreams of the future could remain untainted by knowledge of how fragile safety really was. The manuscript ends with the words Thomas wrote in his final letter to me: "Live well, my darling, live the life that our love made possible." I've tried to honor that request by building something meaningful from the foundation of his sacrifice, by proving that love can inspire action as well as provide comfort, by showing that grief can become a force for good when channeled through service to others. Thomas Sullivan saved 20 families and preserved crucial evidence of humanity's capacity for both evil and heroism. But his greatest legacy may be the proof he provided that ordinary people can choose extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it, that love is indeed stronger than hate, and that individual actions can triumph over institutional evil. The real Thomas, the man I loved, the hero I discovered, the legacy I'm preserving, was someone who understood that true heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's about choosing compassion over comfort, hope over fear, action over inaction, day after day, until those choices become the defining characteristics of a life worth remembering. He lived such a life. He died protecting such a life for others, and through this manuscript, his story will continue inspiring others to make similar choices, ensuring that his heroism echoes through generations in ways that make the world a little brighter. a little safer, a little more worthy of the love he sacrificed everything to protect.